everybody. Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 611. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line all the way from Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, how are things in Scott-Vargas land?
They're good. They're good. Just keep on keeping on as we do.
How's Julie?
Good. She's no longer sleeping down here, but she scampered off to go do Julie things.
She bailed on you right when we were about to record the show when you needed her most. Wow, unbelievable.
Yeah.
We got quite a show today. Luis, we're going to change we're going to change the course of Limited history today. We're very excited about this episode, and we're going to tell you about it when we get into it. Right now, let's just get into the sponsors. ChannelFireball.com, place to go for everything you need magical on the internet. It also extends, by the way, to non-magic games if you're into such things as well. Pokemon, Flesh and Blood, that type of stuff. You can find content and cards and stuff there as well. But beyond that, you can get content. I mentioned it before, but straight on the front page of the site, you'll find a bunch of great articles for free. And if you want to go really deep and get into the pro articles, from people like Andrea Mengucci and Luis Scott-Vargas, you can sign up for CFB Pro, and the pricing structure is really reasonable. You can check it out over there, but if you spend more than like $10 a month at CFB, you can basically get it for free. They'll credit you back $10 in store credit. And so that's pretty easy. And even if not, even if you'd rather just do it straight up, it's not too expensive. And it gets you really in-depth stuff from some of the best players. And that's well worth it. And I mentioned before, but if you just want to check out what the free content side looks like as well, there's a full slate of that on both YouTube and on Channel Fireball. And while you're there, you can pick up Adventures in the Forgotten Realms or any of the old stuff that you might want for a commander deck or your cube or whatever. And you can even sell your cards back to Channel Fireball. It's all over at channelfireball.com. If you do end up buying anything, if you'd use the affiliate code LR, just type in LR on the little code box at checkout. It actually helps out the show and lets them know that we sent you over, and I do appreciate that. The show, of course, is also brought to you by you via the Patreon. It's patreon.com/limited resources. All the details are there, and we want to thank everybody who supports us on the Patreon. It means a lot, more than you probably recognize. And one of the cool things you get is you get to ask questions for the Patreon question of the week. This one comes from Brian, who says, my buddy and I launched a new weekly podcast at the beginning of the year. Marshall was extremely gracious in providing us advice on what we needed to get started. And after 8 months, we're still going strong. Wow, congrats. That is actually much more rare than you might think. Do either of you have any advice on how to expand our audience to reach more people? And then Brian says, our podcast is called Super Talk, and we discuss comic book movies and TV shows. Not magic related, but Luis, what do you think? You're a master marketer. You were VP of marketing over at CFB, and your new role is has marketing involved with it too. What is your approach to this type of stuff?
So first of all, my new role at Good Luck Games, that's the company that makes Storybook Brawl, is actually also VP of marketing. I think I technically am VP of marketing at two different places right now, which I think you can combine to just be the president of marketing, but I don't know. So I think in a sense, like Brian is actually going to be better at answering this question than me, in that you kind of know a little bit of who your community is and where they're found. And I think that there's a couple ways to get people more invested. One that I think is actually really great is Discord. I actually, and here's my own show. Look at this marketing strategy. I made a Discord for constructed resources, of which I am actually active on. So that makes one of the resource podcasts having an active Discord. Discord makes it so easy to make a community. It literally takes you like 15 minutes. And, I'm sure that at this point, Brian's got a nice logo for the podcast. If you've been doing it for this long, you slap that out as your cover photo. You make channels for what people want to talk about. And, it takes your time, but you want to spend time and effort on this, right? Your goal is to make this work. Just be out there hanging out, make yourself approachable. A big part of podcasts is people want to listen to the people who they like hanging out with. They like, kind of a lot of what you get out of podcasts. Not every podcast works this way. You don't listen to Serial because necessarily you want to hang out with the host, even though I'm sure some people do. But a lot of it, it's like I not only enjoy the subject, but I enjoy the person. So giving your fans and the people who make up your community more access to you is just generally a good thing. So Discord would be my first thing. And then second, find just other communities that like this, and you can find ways to kind of promote yourself without just completely shelling. Like you can kind of strike that balance. A good rule of thumb is just always be adding value. Just always be figuring out, like, doing something that makes it so people do want to listen to, and like, don't just like tell someone about the podcast on an unrelated thing if you don't have a reason to think that they're going to enjoy it. Just try to find a way to add value.
Yeah, and I'm going to riff off of a few of the things that you said kind of for my philosophy on content. The first one is to, instead of focusing a ton of energy on, we'll call it marketing here, right? Trying to get it, trick algorithms or be at the top of a list or put your content in front of other people that wouldn't normally be, through pay. You can pay. I mean, you can just pay Facebook or Instagram or whatever to just run ads for your thing. Instead of doing that, prioritize most of your energy, not all of it, but most of it on the content itself, which is what Luis was getting at when he said, provide value. I can, like, here's a good couple of examples that you could use. A new YouTube channel starts, and one person makes videos that are so awesome that people really want to watch them. They're well done. They're well produced. They get their point across. They respect the viewer's time and attention, and they're just good.
They've got wacky thumbnails.
Yeah, right. And what that thing will grow quite quickly, actually, because YouTube's algorithm, for example, is actually designed that if people watch your video, it'll put it in front of more people to watch the video because they want you to watch so that they can serve more ads. That's what it does. It's not picky about it. It's just like, hey, if people are watching your video, it's going to get put in front of others. So the focus should be on having people watch your video, meaning that it's awesome and people want to keep watching it. Then if you contrast that with somebody who makes pretty good content, it's okay, maybe in the middle of the pack where there's kind of a lot like it on YouTube already, and they are trying to trick the algorithm, and they're doing the thumbnails and they're doing the titles that are, clickbait, and they're paying for ads, and they're just doing all these things to try to get those numbers pumped up as quickly as possible. My money's going to be on the good content every single time. It might, you might be able to, and if you had unlimited resources, you would be able to do all of the things, right? But as a person who, this is your job, or this is what you're focusing on as a kind of a side gig, you're not going to be able to do that. And so to me, focus on content first. That should be your priority, and the rest will start to fall into place at some point. The next is, the best type of advertising is word of mouth. That's somebody telling somebody, have you heard this podcast? You need to listen to this podcast. Right. Organic word of mouth. Right. And that is where, like, I like what Luis said about the Discord, because that gives people a place to talk about and get invested in the thing that they already like. Right. Where if you, once again, are trying to trick people onto clicking on a link, or if you're buying ads to have people try to find it, those can have some level of effect, but nothing's going to replace a friend telling another friend, you would love this show, you need to go download it. Like that is just irreplaceable. And again, points back to, if the content's good enough, then people will do that. And then the last thing that I would do, and a strategy we've tried to take on here for LR as well, is to try to make your content available in the most number of places that you can. Make it so that people can find it, right? Like if you're getting picky about your podcast, I'm not going to put it up on Spotify. Well, because, you have to figure out how to do that. Well, you should do that. People do find stuff on there, and that can just be another avenue. This podcast LR, we have it basically every place we can. And that's kind of our model, right? We want to make it accessible for as many people as possible. So, I even have it where you can just download the MP3 that I upload. You can just download that file and put it on a folder on your computer if that's how you like to roll, right? But of course, it's on Google, it's on Apple, it's on all the podcast apps, it's on Spotify, it's on Pandora, it's on Stitcher, it's on YouTube. Like, you can go, my idea is that if you search for it somewhere, it will pop up. And make sure that you got those bases too covered, Brian, so that you can make sure that if somebody does happen to find it or want to search for it, I mean, if they look for it and it's not there, they're probably not going to come back and look for it somewhere else. So there you go. Good luck with the podcast too.
Yeah. I want to add to this that, like, it's also not a dichotomy of, like, do you focus on content or do you try to trick the algorithm? Kind of what you're saying too is that the algorithm and discovery on these services, they're actually on your side.
Yes.
Like all of this stuff, they want the same things you do. They want people to watch your podcast or listen to your podcast, download it, subscribe to it. That's what these companies want as well. So they are pretty smart about this stuff, in some cases too smart. Mm-hmm. And so you won't be able to trick them for long, because they're getting just better and better about making sure that what they're promoting is the stuff people actually like. But lean into it. Like, yeah, put yourself everywhere. And, a lot of these places will give you tips about how to have more people discover your podcast. It's good to look at those, because those are also, like, I know we, for constructed resources and Magic FM, we use Buzzsprout, right? It's just a podcast, like, kind of hosting service. Buzzsprout's like got a lot of hand holding in terms of like, hey, you're a new podcast. Here's some things you can do to increase your reach and find more listeners and all that stuff. And that's not like tricking anyone. That's just them literally telling you, hey, this is how you get more people to try to tune in. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. So yeah, definitely don't approach it with like, like, I'm not saying do all the weird clickbait thumbnails or incendiary things. That's just a whole different ballgame. But keep in mind that the incentives are in the right place for all this stuff, where they want you to succeed. You want yourself to succeed. And hopefully, you can kind of succeed together. But that at its core, it's just make good content you would like to produce, and you kind of go from there. Yeah.
I like what you said there, Luis. I've heard too many people make complaints about, oh, this thing isn't catching on, and then they have some reason for it. There's they've got all number of different excuses about why something isn't working. The algorithm hates me. And it's like, what you're really saying is that people don't listen to or watch my content, or that you don't understand how to read the stats related to it, right? A good example of this, and I'll close up. Obviously, we like to talk about this stuff, but, is people value things like views and subscribers on YouTube, but YouTube doesn't. Like, YouTube doesn't care about views at all. That's just like a vanity thing, right? They want to know how many minutes do people watch your videos for. Minutes watched is what they want, because they can then serve more ads during those minutes. If somebody watches it for the minimum amount of time needed to generate a view, however long that is, that's not useful to them particularly. And subscribers, as many have seen, has really nothing to do with views. It's a validation that your channel has, at least at one point, had people that liked it. But it does not dictate views in any capacity. I mean, you can go and you can see channels that have 200,000 subscribers and their video gets 1,400 views. It's, those things are not correlated necessarily. And so you shouldn't be focusing on them is my point to that. But yeah, good luck with the podcast. I'm impressed, Brian. 8 months is actually, that's way, way longer than most podcasts go for. So you're onto a good thing there. Just keep at it.
And also in chat, someone said a good tool for success is get a popular podcast to read the name of your podcast during an episode.
So, yeah, I mean, this isn't lost on me, but that was a choice. Brian put it in the parentheses after, and I said, sure. Like, well, I don't mind. I like trying to bring people up, right?
Oh, totally. I 100% agree.
Are very. We're big on that.
We call it synergy in the business.
There you go. Oh, God. All right. We need to get off of this double vice president of marketing talk. Let's do a crack a pack real quick here for Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. I guess it's still out there somewhere. Adventures. It seems to have fallen off quite a bit. Yeah. Our first card out is You Hear Something on Watch. Love that card. Charm Sleep. Do not love that card. Jaded Sellsword, medium. Thieves' Tools. You a big Thieves' Tools guy?
No, I've been really unimpressed with Thieves' Tools.
Me too.
It just puts nothing on the board.
No, but people play it a lot.
Well, as we've mentioned in previous episodes, like, it has the issue of the blue-black Saboteur deck just sucks. It's just not good. Yeah. So Thieves' Tools just misses out a pretty substantial amount based on that.
Yeah, agreed. It's also, it makes the other player's removal better. Right? Like, if one of your cards is Thieves' Tools and you put that on a creature and I have one removal spell, I've effectively taken out both of your cards. That's not good for you. Minimus Containment. Yeah, we play that.
Yeah, that one's good.
Elder Guard Ranger. Pretty good. Precipitous Drop. I think that would be my pick here so far.
I'm on Minimus Containment over Drop right now. But
P. Diddy? Come on. Haven't you read it? Pixie Guide. That card flopped. Arcane Investigator was never good. Faraday's Fireball. I play one. I put that
play
in my
it.
deck.
I think it's worse than either of the 3-mana enchantment removal spells.
Agreed. Uncommon, we've got Shesra Death's Whisper. That's the 2 black-green 1/3.
I don't like this card.
It has not played out very well. Next one is 50 Feet of Rope. That's the 1-mana artifact that has all these abilities. I've yet to see this card be good, and don't think I've ever put it into a deck.
One of the lords cast it against me in the showdown before I killed them, but I don't really have. Is it too late to do showdown beats, or is it still the statute of limitations?
No, it's too late. You can't bust out the 50 feet of rope now. Speaking of beats, next card is Fly. Let's just say there's a little note for the Sunset Show about Fly already in there.
Yeah, I would say it didn't quite get to like B+ level, but it was a solid B-. So we can agree on that.
I'm sure we'll talk about that when we get there. But there's good news, because instead of us having to argue about precipitous drop versus minimus containment, we get to just take Adult Gold Dragon.
Yeah.
Boom.
Seems like a plan.
Yeah, that's it. The hitter, the 3 red white 4/3 flying lifelink haste. Awesome card, Bomby. The only nitpick on it is the 3 toughness, which dies to the best common removal spell in the format that only costs 2. So, there are a significant number of games where your Adult Gold Dragon gets to hit maybe once, and it's still sweet. So there you go. Adult Gold Dragon is the easy pick. Okay, Luis, it's time for us to change the game.
All right, I got to do the intro. You gotta let me. So, the title of this episode, which we have not revealed yet on purpose, is Replace Your Bread with Keto. So, as many of you know, bread is an antiquated kind of way to look at limited. And this is like the cheat sheet you would give to new players who haven't drafted much. And you're at F&M and you convinced your friend to come out. They're like, I don't really know what to do in a draft. You're like, all right, bread, bombs, evasion, removal. We had to look this up because it's so
in the other order, but yeah, it's not
bombs, removal, evasion, aggro, duds.
And nobody knows what those last ones are. And even the evasion, some people say efficiency. It's like, this is like one of the most useless constructs we've ever had in Limited, right?
Yeah. And just so we're completely clear, we don't think anyone really uses this these days. Mm-hmm. We like obviously the title's clickbait because we're trying to optimize for the algorithm, but I've only heard people make fun of bread and talk about why it's bad. I've never really heard anyone kind of espouse it unironically, but that doesn't mean that there isn't some value here. And what our goal is with this episode is to give you kind of a cheat sheet that you can either use for yourself or people of in what order should you prioritize things when drafting and also ultimately building decks. And we've got a new acronym for you. Of course, completely randomly, we've decided that you should be replacing bread with more of a keto diet. So let's get into it, Marshall.
Yeah. So, Luis covered it. Bread is mostly useless. I actually have heard it used unironically in LGSs, so it does still kind of float around. But under even a little bit of scrutiny, it falls apart almost immediately. The 2 primary issues with it are, 1, nobody knows what it actually stands for, except for bombs and removal. Okay. And the second one is that bombs and removal, even that start, isn't particularly useful. So we completely scrapped it for keto because, well, for starters, our first letter K isn't going to reference bombs at all. We believe that in reality, where these things, like if you want to actually use this at a local game store on somebody who's like, look, I kind of know the rules of Magic. I've been playing for a bit, but it's my first draft. Can you give me just like a framework to go for? Well, you're going to tell them keto from now on, and you don't need to tell them to take bombs. Everybody knows inherently in Magic that dragons are cool. You do not need to teach new players that. I've never seen a player look at some sweet bomby dragon, mythic rare, whatever, and go, and take some random comment over it. They always go, whoa, this is sweet. They go right to the back of the pack. I believe it's part of human nature that we just know the rares at the back and they take it. Anyway.
In fact, Marshall, Magic Design leveled up a lot, over a decade ago when they started making those cards also the good cards. Cause there was a while where, you would want to, someone would want to put a Sheevan Dragon in their deck and they're like, no. Doomblade is where it's at. Don't put that in. Counterspell and Doomblade are the cool cards. Sheevan Dragon, Royal Assassin, Sarah Angel, those aren't the good ones. So
right.
Magic Design lines up with people's intuition. So there's a couple things that we want to kind of clarify here. One, people don't typically pass the ridiculous bombs to begin with. You don't really need to like impress upon them, hey, you should take the most awesome card in the pack. The second is there are bombs that aren't obvious, right? But telling someone, hey, take bombs isn't going to help them when the bombs aren't obvious.
Right.
So it's not really like that useful to try to lay this out as a category when the category itself either is self-evident or isn't. And either way, I don't think it's, particularly useful to try to drill down as to, hey, That's you right. should be taking the really appealing cards first.
So instead, we've decided to cast a wider net and to start with and to cover things that actually happen draft in and draft out, right? You don't always open a bomb anyway. But here's something that you will see every single draft that you do, and that's the K, and it stands for kill spells. Specifically efficiently costed removal spells, but kill spells are the most often first pick thing that you'll see in Limited. It's more often than bombs because there's simply more of them around than bombs are. And these are the things that are the greatest commodity that you see drafted and draft out.
So when you look at the top commons of any set, how often is the, red 2-mana deal 3 or whatever the good black removal is the best common in their colors and the best common overall? And the answer is pretty frequently.
Yeah, like 75%.
There's a reason for that.
Yeah, it's most of the time. Yeah.
Yeah. And if your deck is consistently losing to something, the one thing that'll fix it the most is kill spells. You feel it when you don't have them. When you do have them, you feel a lot more protected, and you have outs to, stopping your opponent's ridiculous bombs or even just their normal creatures. Plus, people don't tend to pass it, and even sometimes when it's wrong, people don't pass it at a very high rate. Mm-hmm. So you definitely want to focus on these. And if all you take from this is, hey, removal's good, that's a good place to start because that is really where you do need to start. And a lot of this is how can we help newer players or people who just need a check-in to refocus. I remember when we did the Cabs episode, which this is obviously has some similarities to it.
You mean the Carbs episode?
Oh, no, yeah, the Carbs episode. No, we cut that one. It's just always good to run a check-in. It's always good to make sure you know what you should be prioritizing. And as we go through the letters, we'll kind of help you do that.
That's right. And so to focus on K for kill spells here, right? You can view card groups in Limited as kind of commodities, right? And you can break them down fairly specifically as well. So for example, creatures, right? This is the biggest group of cards in Limited. And getting enough creatures is very rarely a problem these days. You can get enough numbers of them into your deck, but the good ones, right, is a harder thing to get. Easily the biggest, the commodity that's the hardest to get, let's say out of the commons specifically, are removal spells, kill spells, right? These are the things that you kind of always wish you had more of. And even though you took one every time you had the opportunity to, and that's why they take priority. There are just fewer of them, and you can view it as a sliding scale. There's the good removal, efficient, roughly the best of low cost, instant speed, unconditional, like the furthest along those scales that you can get, all the way up to the more expensive, slower conditional removal. And we're talking about, say stuff on the good half of that spectrum here. Those are the things that are draft in and draft out the hardest to get. And you won't get that many chances to get it. So you have to really prioritize it. The reason, of course, why we like removal, and we've done episodes about this, but the very short version is this type of removal, specifically the ones that trend towards low cost, instant speed, and unconditional as far, again, as you can get down those roads, is really the best way in Limited to get ahead on card advantage right? You can 2-for-1 somebody numerous ways and limited with it. And also tempo. A lot of times you're going to spend, hey, perfect example from the Crack-A-Pack. Somebody plays Dragon's Fire on your Adult Gold Dragon. They spent 2 mana, you spent 5. They are now ahead on tempo. That means that they can free up that mana to spend something else and maybe get themselves ahead on board. And removal, especially this type, is the best way to do that.
I think a good way to think about it is you rarely can have too much removal. You can definitely have too much of almost any other category. It's possible to have too many 2-drops. Definitely possible to have too many expensive cards or cards that aren't really affecting the board or, that equipment, all that stuff. I don't think too much removal is a real problem to worry about. Some people are like, well, how many Dragon's Fires would you play if you had any amount? It's like, yeah, I guess I would cut it at like 8 or something, but right. It's not really just like a realistic place to end up. And I think that people would be, I think, pretty well served by just prioritizing these things and trying to figure out like the bar to not take a removal spell is pretty high. Now, I do want to say that the calculus changes quite a bit once you go above 4 mana. I think that's the threshold. Removal spells that cost 4 or less mana are excellent. Almost all across the board. Removal spells that cost 5 or more start to dip into the Faraday's Fireball, Eyes of the Beholder. I don't know if I'm going to run this range. So obviously there is a bit of a dividing line, but all the best cards tend to be removal. There's a reason for that, and you should prioritize them accordingly.
That's right. So there's your number 1. That's K, kill spells. Now that moves us to E. And E stands for, take it away, Luis.
Efficient creatures. And this is actually a bigger difference than I think most people might realize. And this is part of, I actually think E is literally one of E and T are actually the two big reasons I wanted to do this. Because when you look at what cards are good, you really, really want to make sure that you have efficient creatures because those are a scarce resource. It's not as easy as just saying, hey, I need X number of creatures. And first of all, let me take a slight sidebar. There is no number of creatures that you need to have in a limited deck. There really is not a useful number there. Like I can tell you that the average is like 12 to 14 or something like that. But when you say, hey, your deck only has 11 creatures, it's just like, okay, that's fine. That's just how it works sometimes. Your deck only has 7 or you have 18 creatures. There's no number that really you need to really focus on in order to have the right number of creatures. It all is just contextual. You need to make sure that you have enough stuff to defend yourself, enough ways to win the game, but there's no magical number to hit, and I be suspicious if people say otherwise.
Well, but you're not saying that. There's context, right? Let's say that you were going to try to draft a Cabs deck.
Yeah.
If you drafted a 7-creature Cabs deck, you did something wrong.
It's true. There is some context to it.
So how do we convey that?
I think that the best way to convey that is to just look at what your deck's needs are and look at basically a couple different things. One, what is your win condition? Like, are you trying to attack them? Obviously, if you're trying to attack them, you need more creatures than if you're not. How are you going to defend yourself? Like, what do you have to play in the early turns? You can play a 7-creature deck as long as you have enough copies of like Shock and, Lash of Malice or whatever early removal spells that exist. And then what are your finishers? What ultimately are you going to use to close out the game? Because we both won plenty of matches with very, very few creatures in our deck, and we both won matches with lots of creatures in our deck. I just think that it's not that useful to look at it as like a threshold you have to hit.
Yeah.
And it's
tough because I do see uses in the guideline for it for new players.
Yeah.
Like I would tell somebody to play 15-ish creatures.
I think that
if they hadn't drafted before.
Yeah, I think that that's not an unreasonable number to look at. But I think in general, it's good to focus more on just your curve than the actual number.
Sure,
is the other thing.
Right, and so hence the efficient.
And there's a reason that there's such a focus on efficiency here. We've used the example before of you have to eat your vegetables before you can have your dessert.
Right.
And the E here, and also keto, you don't eat much dessert. That's part of the whole deal. The E here really has to do with you need to make sure you have enough 2-drops so that you can take the 5 and 6 drops later. if you've watched me draft when I'm, trying to draft a real deck, when I take a 2-drop over a 5-drop, it's not because I think the 2-drop's more powerful. It clearly isn't. It's that if you spend some early picks on 2-drops, later you can take a 5-drop over a different 2-drop and feel pretty good about it, because you can definitely lose not having enough 2-drops. It's not really easy to lose because you don't have enough 5-drops.
Right. And that's where the efficiency comes in, because look, if you're new to limited, or if there's somebody new to limited in your local game store and you tell them you got to draft KETO, right? You are emphasizing that creatures ultimately are the most important card type in limited. They are available in enough numbers that you don't need to prioritize them in most cases over removal, but they are what is going to prevent you from dying and also win the game in most scenarios, right? When you think about limited, you think, well, what stops me from getting killed by my opponent? And your initial instinct might be, well, removal does, because they're going to attack me with the creature, and then I can kill their creature and then they can't attack me with it. But that's not actually how it plays out. Snapshot any of your limited games on turn 7, and one player will have some number of creatures threatening to block the other creatures on the other side and effectively nullifying 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 creatures, right? The kind of classic example is I have a 2/4. You have a 2/2. You can't attack me. Okay, let's say I'm at 15 life or whatever. Okay, now you have 2 2/2s. Can you attack me? No. Now you have 3 of them. Can you attack me? No, not really. Not to just get in for 4 damage. Now you have 4 of them. Can you attack me? Still no, right? Like my 2/4 is effectively acting as a removal spell for, multiple of your creatures. That's why creatures are so important, because they can attack and block. And so you can choose during the course of the game what role you think you need them to play. So they're extremely important. What differentiates creatures these days? Efficiency, right? We can look down the line and categorize most creatures in a set as air quotes playable, right? Meaning that it's not 4 mana for a 0/1 that can't do anything, right? Where you would just be like, I literally just can't put this in my deck. Good example was for our Crack-a-Pack, right? We had Arcane Investigator, 1 and a blue for a 2/1, and it has 5 and a blue, roll a d20, and then good stuff happens, right? Like, we never play that card, even in blue. I've seen it on the battlefield just a handful of times in 100 plus drafts of this format. Yet, it is still a 2 mana 2/1 with a relevant activated ability in the late game. Why don't we see it? Because it's not efficient enough. It doesn't affect the board in the way we need it to affect the board when we cast it. So it gets bumped out by more efficient creatures. And that's why you need to focus on them here in E. Also, I want to note that you should be prioritizing the 2, 3, and 4 cost creatures the most. These make up the bread and butter of your mana curve in most scenarios. So if somebody, if you wanted to go a little deeper with the person that you were helping, you could tell them that 1-drops are relevant. They do matter, but similar to cards that cost 5 mana or more, they have diminishing returns, because if you run too many of them, they become a problem, right? If your whole deck is made of 1-drops, you just don't have enough power and toughness to actually get the job done, even if you can dump your hand most games. If you run too many 6-drops, you've got all the power and toughness and whatever that you want, but you can't deploy them in a time that is reasonable to be able to win the game. So what it pushes things towards the middle, which is, on 2, 3, and 4, and in that order. 2-drops are the most important, then 3s and 4s, on average, I would say. You agree with that, Luis?
I think 2-drops are the class you should focus on the most, actually. Like,
yeah. That's what I said.
Like,
yeah.
Yeah, but no, even specifically 2-drops, not even 3s and 4s.
Oh, I see. Okay. Uh-huh.
The difference between the 2s, 3s, and 4s, it's big. So, like, ones have a kind of weird thing going on where 1-drops tend to only be interesting for like very specific decks. Your 1 mana 1/1 flyer with upside is the sort of thing that, like, your really aggressive deck wants it, or your 1/1 with like a weird ability means your synergy deck wants it. And then 5+ drops are a different animal. We're not talking about those. Like that, those are the things that if you had to like choose one of these categories, like one of those stupid, like, which kind of food would you never eat again? Honestly, if you wanted to have a balanced diet, this is the theme we're going with this
there
whole,
you
this
go.
whole thing.
I love it.
you would cut out five drops, 5+ drops.
Yep.
Because you can win without those. You can't win without cheap things, and especially twos. The reason twos are so good is when you play a card on turn 2, you used your mana on turn 2, you get to affect the board. You never get that mana back if you don't use it. And what will often happen is you don't play a 2-drop on turn 2 and your hand's 2 3-drops. That second 3-drop might literally never get played or not get played for so long.
Yeah.
It's just a complete different thing. Like, have you ever had the experience where on turn 3 you draw your 2-drop? Well, now you got to play your 3-drop, and next turn you're going to play your 4-drop. And if you're lucky, next turn you're going to play your 5-drop, or maybe you don't have a 5th land. When is this 2-drop coming out? I mean, how powerful is Black Lotus? Obviously insane, right? How powerful is Soul Ring? You getting to spend your mana on turn 2 is kind of like you got a Soul Ring for a turn when you wouldn't have otherwise spent it. So don't underestimate how important it is to have cards that cost 2 specifically, because also when you draw 3 2-drops, you go 2-drop into 3-drop into double 2-drop on turn 4, you're doing great.
Yep.
When you draw too many 3-drops, you're like nothing turn 2, 3-drop on turn 3, and I guess 3-drop on turn 4, just so much further behind.
So much worse. So
this is a reason that, look, you're completely right about Arcane Investigator. We don't play that card very often. It's not a good card. Blue also sucks. That plays into it. But there's a reason Steadfast Paladin is one of the best white commons. And there's a reason that cards in that slot typically overperform. And you might be surprised, why is this so much better than other cards, similar to it? Why do people make such a big deal out of taking these 2-drops instead of 2 mana 2/2 with upside versus 3 mana 2/3?
Mm-hmm.
One of those cards is marginally playable. The other is like really high impact. It's just because having a 2-drop is such a big difference between not, and you'll win a lot more if you start prioritizing them.
There you go. So efficient creatures. So we've got kill spells and efficient creatures. Next in the order is your top end, right? This is your 5+ mana threats. Basically, it can be really any spell, but this is the stuff that you would typically use to kind of finish the game. And the reason that this is the T is because this comes very definitively after K and E, right? You do want some of these cards, but you want to get your efficient creatures and get your kill spells before your top end.
And this is, again, part of the reason I was excited to do this is because it's kind of a check-in on what Modern Limited looks like.
Yeah.
And, there was a lot of formats I played, and part of it was my own obstinance, but part of it was the actual formats where you shouldn't take 2-drops over 4 and 5-drops most of the time. The cards that didn't affect the board were okay because people weren't really getting in there as quickly. That's just no longer how it works. And the top end is just, again, it's the last thing you need to fill out. Like, yes, you do want things to cast when the game goes to turn 5 and 6 and beyond. But the way sets are designed these days, that's just not something that you need to stress about because there's almost always something to do. How many games in the last, say, year do you think you've lost because you've completely run out of stuff to do?
Never.
Yeah, I mean, the answer
it's
literal
so
zero,
rare.
but it's just it just doesn't really happen.
I don't even factor it in at this point.
That used to be a big thing, and this is why this is also a good refresher for people who have drafted a lot but maybe haven't adjusted to the new paradigm. I know that I've definitely had my struggles before too. It's that you don't have to worry about, how am I going to finish this off? What's my top end look like compared to before? Because hey, some of your lands can be played as spells because there's flip lands. Sometimes, these cards will have the 9 mana kicker options that mean that your 2-drop all of a sudden has just a huge impact on the late game. There's just, card after card. Oh, this lesson card lets me pull a 5-drop out of my board, and I've got 5 lesson cards. So it's like I have an additional 5-drop 4/4s.
Right.
And all that adds up over and over again to where I'm just looking and I'm like, yeah, I don't need to generally prioritize your, whatever 6 mana card that normally you would be prioritizing. And look, there's some exceptions where something like Hill Giant Herd Gorger, for example, it's above the curve. That one has done a good job. And obviously, like when you look at something as general as this, there's going to be some exceptions and you're going to need to try to figure out how to prioritize those things. But for the most part, you can almost ignore your top end until you've got everything else figured out, because look at the average card that costs 5+ mana in these sets. It's going to do a good job when you cast it. It's not, a high priority. Like there's a reason we're not taking Herald of Hadar or, the Menacing Beholder, like all that high. They're not that exciting. But if you don't have one of those, like, how problematic is it versus like, or if you don't have one of the high tier ones, how problematic is it to replace it with one of the lower tier ones? It doesn't really matter that much,
not
right?
that big of a deal. Yeah.
When you spend 6 mana on a card, you these days you tend to get 6 mana worth of value out of that card. It's just not, you're not really losing out too much by doing so. Whereas if you took the decent to good 5-drop over a 2-drop, and then later you end up like, well, I've got 4 5-drops, but I only have 2 2-drops. You're feeling one of those situations a lot more than you're feeling the other. So a big part of the, putting T, closer to the end here is you don't need to prioritize top end anymore. Yes, good 6 mana cards are good, but these are not something that should be high on your pick order, and they're not something that you should be going out of your way to pick up. So if you don't know what all the premium top end cards are, that's totally fine. You can use as shorthand. Basically, don't prioritize these. The bar for them is so much higher than the bar for the lower cards. Of course, eventually, to really master a format, you're going to want to know all this stuff. But this shorthand is not for people who've completely mastered a format. It's for how do you approach a newer format? How do you help someone else approach a newer format or a format they haven't played much? And trust me, when we go into Innistrad, we're going to be saying the same thing, that like, hey, look, this 6 mana common looks pretty cool, but you should probably take the 2 mana 2/1 first strike over it, or the 2 mana 2/1 when it attacks, you gain a life, or whatever the theme is for that set. Draw a card and discard a card. There's going to be a 2-drop that may not be as flashy, but is important. And while you do have to worry about finishing out games, you don't have to worry as much as you used to. And that's why top end is something that's a little bit lower in the priority order than it used to be, and for good reason.
Kill spells, efficient creatures, top end, and that leaves O. And O stands for other. And the reason that we have such a vague group for the last is because when you do draft sort of a typical limited deck, especially as a beginner, you are going to be a creature-based mid-range deck most of the time, maybe leaning towards aggression. And other can be the really tough part for people to navigate, right? These are the non-creature, kind of non-cabs cards. Think build-around cards, enchantments, equipment, combat tricks, most card draw spells, auras, kind of all of the random stuff that basically isn't creatures and removal. They can be extremely good in small quantities, right? I mean, these are the types of cards that like the best decks have these elements to them, but aren't overdone. Because look, there's a conflict that happens here, right? If you build a cab style mid-range leaning towards aggression deck. So again, cards that affect the board state, creatures, removal, maybe some combat tricks. And those are the only type of cards that you put in your deck. You are a one-directional deck. You are trying to kill your opponent with your creatures, and that's it. You do not have any cards that do anything other than try to kill your opponent with your creatures. And that's a very powerful thing to have. But if you start adding in these other cards, you're going to step on that premise at some point. Your idea of winning the game by establishing a better board state and then killing your opponent with your creatures is going to start to fall apart if you're like, hey, look, I drew teleportation circle and I needed to have one more creature to punch in through the damage, or I drew this random aura that doesn't, make another creature. It just makes one of my creatures better, but it doesn't actually get it in for damage, that type of thing. These are the type of cards that after you get your kind of drafty and sea legs under you, then you can really maximize and try to get these going. But if somebody says, hey, this is only like second time I've drafted before, can you just give me some advice? And you go, KETO, this is why other falls into this category, because it's very common to find newer players not make any distinction between cards that are going to actively push them towards the most likely victory, like creatures removal, combat tricks. And instead, they will say, oh, well, this looks cool. Like, this is an interesting card. I'll take it. And then they'll take, something that draws them a bunch of cards or draws cards. Like, they'll have too many of those type of cards. Then they'll have some interesting enchantment that augments your mana or whatever. Okay, that's kind of cool, but not really doing what we need to do here. And then they'll take a ramp spell, right, in their mid-range deck that only curves out to 5. And it's like, well, you'd rather have a creature there rather than just some, get an extra land onto the battlefield or mana fixing or something. And then pretty soon they have 10 of these type of cards. And now they don't have a strategy anymore. And so that's why they need to get pushed to the bottom here, because if you're just learning, you should be deprioritizing these just at the very beginning so that you can go, okay, I get how this works now. I play these creatures out. I kill your creatures. I kill you. Now you've got your fundamentals and you can start building from there into the really interesting but harder to draft stuff like, hey, I opened up Teleportation Circle. I don't know what this does or if it's very good, but as a newer drafter, not my first draft, but as a newer drafter, I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to take Teleportation Circle, and now I'm going to use my brain to say, okay, what are the types of cards that I can take that can take advantage of a card like this without trashing my deck? But if it's your second time drafting ever, that is going to be way too much for you to process in the moment. And I would say you'd be much better off just drafting a straight up creature deck that's almost guaranteed to put some game plan into effect. I mean, remember, a lot of the times that you first pick Teleportation Circle, you don't end up running it because you don't get enough stuff to support it. Are you going to be able to make that judgment call in your second draft ever? No. You're just going to put it into your deck because you first picked it and it's a rare and you're like, let's see what happens. By avoiding these decisions early, you get a better chance to kind of understand fundamentally what's going on. And that's why O for other is in the last place here.
And even though not everything is a trap these days. It's not always like, hey, all these nonsensical cards, don't end up working out or whatever. It's still really good to make sure that you're not loading it up with too many of the things that really don't get you to where you want to be. And again, we're talking shorthands here. So I think one of the things that's really important for folks to keep in mind is that here, we talk about heuristics a lot. It's one of my favorite things. They only go so far, and what we're not trying to tell you is all the exceptions here. Yes, clearly you can draft your 7-creature deck. You can draft your deck with 10 cards that don't affect the board if you can do it right. But having a good baseline is really important for being able to kind of tackle what's next. Yeah. And it's not always easy to figure out what that happens to be. So I think that looking at kind of what this we're trying to tell you here, it does two things. One, it shows you where we think the focus is when it comes to Modern Limited, which is very much like cheap creatures, removal spells, cheap creatures, then more expensive stuff, and then just like the kind of nonsense that goes otherwise. And part of the interesting thing about Limited is like it's not always going to be the same. In some cases, that ends up swapping around, and there's some formats where, I mean, we haven't seen a format in a long time where 2-drops don't matter, but you could believe there's formats where 2-drops don't matter.
It's happened before.
Yeah. And, you kind of have to know the rules before you can break them. That's something that I always, firmly believe. Yeah. And knowing where things are at before deciding to stray from that is really important. There's a reason that, when a lot of people see me draft or play, I'm not just look. I promise you, I'm not just making excuses for bad behavior here. The reason when people see a lot of that, it can be kind of confusing because it's like, hey, why did you do that? That's something you generally recommend against, and it's just like, yeah, that's because I know how it works enough to know when to go a different direction.
Right.
You have to be at a certain level before you can start breaking all the rules, and it doesn't help if you don't know the rules. Plus, we firmly believe that teaching something really helps you get better at it, and that's part of the reason we do the podcast. We get joy and value out of that. And part of the reason that if you want to get better at something, try teaching it to someone who doesn't know how to do it well, because you will get better at the thing that you're explaining. If you can't explain something well, it does call into question a little, how well do you know that thing?
Right. Yes. And, there's to zoom out here on the keto as well. This is really important note. This is not your guide on how to be the best drafter that you can be. We've done whole episodes on that. You can look them up and you will get very in-depth looks at what the optimal builds are for these for all types of decks and how you should approach control decks, aggro decks, mid-range decks, combo decks as they are, build around decks basically in Limited, where we break down each of those different types of decks and then give you ideas for how you should approach drafting them and what they typically look like. That's optimal drafting when you understand everything that's going on. KETO is not that. KETO is for people who don't know the things that you know yet and that need to get an understanding, as Luis described, of the fundamentals first. That's what it is. So if you're looking at this and going, really? Remember, this is our replacement for bread, right? And bread was never going to teach you how to be a good drafter, ever.
I do want to say that this is also kind of our replacement or not replacement, but like an update of cabs, where when we talk about the cards that we're talking about here, it is cards that affect the board. We have a focus on that. I do think that the one of the biggest differences that is worth focusing on is really where the 2-drops line up versus everything else. Because I do think that that's still a fundamental change that people still haven't firmly kind of incorporated into their Limited game plans based on how well some of these cheap creatures perform in draft and how that they're not valued at I think the degree that they need to be valued even now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So keep that in mind if you're going to use this, for a friend or somebody that you may, hey, kill spells, efficient creatures, top end, other, right? Go in that order. And as a beginner, you're going to have a lot more success. We've been proponents of this in the cabs. Was born out of this, and KETO is going to be part of this as well. That if you're somebody who is floundering at draft, you just cannot seem to figure it out. Maybe you're comfortable with it, but with like the process of it, but you just find yourself losing a lot. That if you revert to the fundamentals and then expand from there, that's the best route to get you back to kind of that optimal state. Because I've definitely seen it where people start off kind of, okay, I'm going to draft creatures, I'm going to do this thing, and they do pretty well, but then they draft a really good card, right? There's just some cool card that they draft, some rare, enchantment that augments their creatures or whatever, and they're like, wow, that was sweet. And then in another deck, they draft like 2 or 3 card draw spells, and those aid them in winning a game that they may not have otherwise. So like, these are sweet. And then some kind of expensive but pretty powerful equipment comes out in a set, and they'll draft that and throw it in a deck. And next thing you know, they're doing all of those things at once, right? And if you just laid out the deck, it's like, what are we doing here? You've got not enough creatures to support this aura that wants to have your deck go wide. But then also you've got this really clunky, expensive equipment, but not that many creatures to put it on, where you kind of allow your opponent to leverage their removal, where you go pay 5 to equip and they kill it. And you're like, okay, now you're way behind and you're going to have a hard time. And then you're sprinkling in these card draw spells that don't go with any of this, right? And next thing you know, your deck just doesn't work very well. It's fundamentally flawed. Where if you can get back to cabs to kind of as a palate cleanser, and if you can use KETO to get yourself back there, because again, this, as Luis said, this does describe how to get a fundamental deck in Limited in most scenarios, then you can start to go, okay, don't do all of the other at once. Start to pick and choose. This deck actually could use a couple of removal spells. So I'm going to keep it pretty close to the vest, but I am going to play these not removal, card draw spells. I am going to play these extra card draw spells, right? Or, have some fun with it. Hey, I picked teleportation circle. Let's see if this thing can go. And you start to piece together the pieces that would go well with a teleportation circle, but that you could also see yourself playing without getting maximally punished if you don't happen to draw it. Because remember, there's only one in your deck. Now you're starting to get into the real, what a lot of our episodes are about here on differentiating and how to build these things into subtle nuances. But if you're new, you don't have that ability yet. And this is where this KETO thing and the cabs thing and all that stuff can really come in. So keep that in mind when you're helping people out, that they don't know the things that you know yet. And if you give them these tools, that's such a huge upgrade. Just putting a deck into their hands that has a good mana curve with enough creatures and stuff that actually matters when they cast it, that's going to bump their win percentage like 15%. Like, because they just look and they go, well, here's a creature, I guess I'll cast it. And it's like, good, you just took a step towards winning, right? Where one of the hidden benefits to these cabs decks also can mask the fact, and Keto is a part of this, can mask the fact that if I throw a bunch of card draw spells and conditional cards and build arounds and stuff into a deck, that deck's a lot harder to play than a deck that says play creature, kill creature, make my creature better, right? These are my 3 types of cards that I play in my deck. And I'm going to do one of those on most of the turns of the game, maybe even 2 on some turns of the game. It's hard to screw that up royally, right? It's like you can, if you just play out a creature on the board, you're probably doing something relatively positive, even if it wasn't the perfect creature to play on that turn or whatever. But if you have a card draw spell and you really need a creature on the board and you, for whatever reason, decide to play the card draw spell, it could lose you the game on the spot. You might just be too far behind at that point. And this kind of masks that by deprioritizing those types of cards. So there's some stuff built into this that isn't obvious, but I think if you think about it, it'll become more clear to you.
And you know what? If we're both being honest with each other, it's helpful for us to refresh this too, because we don't always practice what we preach, and sometimes it's fine. You're breaking the rules because you think it's right in this instance, or just because you want to do something else. You first pick teleportation circle because you want to feel something, and that's totally fine. But when it comes to something like, say, the LR versus LOL showdown, like I want to make sure you're sticking to your keto diet here, since because
that's right.
That's when the kind of the money, or pride in this case, is on the line, and that's the sort of thing that you want to focus on, because at the end of the day, only you can determine what your goals are when drafting. But if your goal is to improve and get better, I mean, this is a really good way to do so. Yeah,
and I mean that's a great point, Luis, because we love to do all the fun, goofy stuff too. We'll do it on our streams or videos all the time, and we encourage you to do that. That is really part of the fun part about Limited, but we understand that a big part of the reason you're here to hang out with Luis and I is because you want to improve. And that's why we focus on this stuff on the show. We do not have any problem with you experimenting and trying stuff. That is really part of the joy of Limited. It's just, if you're sitting down and you want to win, that's what we're talking about here. Okay. Keto, baby. We changed the world today, Luis. We put bread back in the box, and now keto's out.
That's been true for a few years. But I think if you take anything away from this episode, I want to say 2 main points. One, the good 2-drops are better than you think. I think that's true. And then the other is that sets are not built so that you run out of stuff to do these days. So don't worry about having a high end. Just worry about how you're going to get to the point where you need one. Because the mechanics in every single set over the last couple years have really pushed it to, you shouldn't care about your high end. You shouldn't care about your high end, because there's just all these natural outlets to have that. So make sure that you're kind of aware of these fundamental shifts. And you know what? Maybe the next set will change that and this won't apply. But I don't think that's going to be the case based on their repeated, kind of desire to go back to the same wells.
Right. Kill spells, efficient creatures, top end, other. You're welcome, world. We've left our mark today, Luis. Let's call the show there. If you want to find us on social media, I'm Marshall's _LR, and Luis is LSV. You can find everything related to the podcast at lrcast.com. And I want to thank our sponsor, Channel Fireball, one more time. Make sure you check them out for really anything you need. I mentioned it briefly, but you can sell your cards back to CFB as well. This is a good way to kind of manage your collection. You can do them for store credit for a bonus, or you can even just get cash if you need it. And there's even a couple of ways to do it. All the information's over at Channel Fireball on how to do that. We do encourage you to check them out. And thanks for hanging out with us this week. We'll see you next time.
So I do want to shout out to Gabby Sparks again, because she's come up with some banger episodes. Whenever it's 20 minutes before the show and it's like, we need an episode, that's where we're going to turn to.
This is this is like some classic, keto. I mean, are you kidding me?
Amazing, really. But I wanted to touch on the big Magic announcements we got yesterday, because it's somehow become like a thing. I don't know. Basically, they announced what the kind of product offerings will be for next year. So that includes like Kamigawa, or the Neon Destiny or something like that. I don't remember the Neon Evangelion or whatever.
Future or whatever, yeah.
It's basically, we're going back to Kamigawa, but like 1,000 years in the future, and it's like cyberpunk. That seems cool to me. I like it. We've got like the Brothers War. We've got a couple, whatever these sets are. But the thing that I think has gathered most attention is they're going to continue to expand Universes Beyond and Secret Lairs in the way that we kind of knew they would. There's literally going to be a Fortnite Secret Lair. There's going to be a Street Fighter one. And it seems kind of like foolish to say this, but like just let people like the things they want to like, because I'll be completely honest with you. These basically all the announcements weren't really for me. Like, I don't care about them. I don't care that Magic has Fortnite. It doesn't detract from my experience, but it doesn't really add to it. It just is what it is. And if some people like it, great. Like, I think the Lord of the Rings stuff's cool. I think Street Fighter's cool. I largely don't care about where they're going with all these alternate cards. Feels like they announce a secret lair every single day, and it's like, that's neat. At some point, maybe I'll want one of these things. For the most part, I haven't really been too excited about them. What the sets that are coming also seem fairly cool. Like I do like, the looks of some of them. I think the Cyberpunk idea is pretty cool. Brothers War, getting Urza and Mishra, that's all great. But I care more about, hey, where am I going to get to play these cards? You mentioned in the preamble that what Ethan said, one of the Lords Limited, he said, I don't care what's coming out as long as we get to draft it. And that's kind of like where my mind's at. It's not not even specifically focused on draft as much, but I don't care what set is coming out. I just want to know, hey, where can I play an event which I care about the stakes of, and that like and I understand that like right now is not the time to launch a new OP system. I'm not arguing that in any stretch, but I do think that when I look at these announcements, it's not like, oh, we're getting Fortnite, this is so stupid, or why are we getting Fortnite instead of OP? It's just not on that scale. Like, we're not getting these things because instead of the things you want, we're just getting these things because this is what they're going to focus on. I would love to see a good OP announcement. That's going to obviously do a lot for my engagement with the game and what I enjoy. I think you too, right? Like that. Yes. That is a lot of how you interact with this. But that doesn't mean that I look at the Street Fighter Secret Lair, or the Fortnite Secret Lair, or the Lord of the Rings, whatever, and think like, wow, OP died for this, because it didn't. OP died for a lot of different reasons that don't really have much to do with these things. And yes, there's some like overlap and a little bit of tension of like where their attention is going. But for the most part, if someone's excited about the new things, I won't begrudge them that. They don't do it for me, but there's a reason Magic's so awesome. A lot of different people can play the game. There's a lot of different aspects you can kind of get attached to and really get enchanted by. And it happens for me that's playing in competitive events. And if we get some news on that front, I'll be really excited. But I also wouldn't begrudge someone who's saying like, competitive events, who cares about that? I don't care about that. And it's like, yeah, that's great. You don't have to, and I'm not really asking you to.